the gateway signal. The St. Louis humidity hung thick as molasses, drenching Elliot Reese as he trudged toward the gateway arch, that towering, gleaming slice of silver bisecting the evening sky. It loomed ahead, cool and alien, as the last threads of sunlight played off its surface, casting strange shadows across the city's grime. Sweat pooled at his collar, gluing his shirt to his back as he upped his pace. This relentless August heat felt like it was punishing him for every poor choice he'd made to end up here. 25 years old, supposed to be in the prime of his life, and here he was, not in some high-powered research lab, but slogging his way through janitorial shifts at a 6 to 30-foot monument to manifest destiny. The astronomy degree, nothing but a decoration on his wall. But if this nightly grind afforded him anything, it was solitude, a precious quiet bubble away from the condescending stares of his peers and the crushing weight of his student debt. He pushed open the heavy glass door, escaping into the arch's chilled lobby. "Evening, Joe," he muttered to the security guard behind the desk, flashing his ID. Joe barely looked up. "You're early, Reese. Again." The man's gaze drifted back to his monitor, expression as blank as the blue-white glow from the screen. Elliot shrugged, hoping to keep the small talk to a minimum. "Yeah, just like to get a jump on things," he replied, though the truth was he needed every hour he could scrape together. Pride, however, kept his lips clamped shut. Once inside the janitor's closet, he pulled on his jumpsuit, the dull grey uniform of a man who could fade into the background. Gateway Arch Maintenance was stitched in faded letters on the pocket, just in case anyone forgot where he worked. Cart in tow, he began his routine, mop in hand, mind slipping effortlessly to the subject that never let him go. The mysteries of ancient civilizations, the whispers of extraterrestrial life, and the old secrets humanity had buried under piles of ignorance and denial. Elliot's mind thrummed with unsolved questions, a relentless ticker tape of intrigue that he couldn't shake. While others laughed at his theories, Elliot knew he was on to something. He saw the patterns others dismissed as coincidence. He felt the echoes of ancient wisdom hidden in mythology and scattered through history. And tonight the urge to dig, to unearth, felt like a compulsion, a gnawing in his gut that wouldn't let go. As he pushed his mop across the polished marble, his thoughts drifted to his current obsession, a half-translated Sumerian text alluding to a cataclysm that had supposedly leveled civilizations. The warnings were woven in metaphor, cryptic, half-whispered, but Elliot could feel a dark truth lurking underneath. Then, suddenly, a sound stopped him cold. Faint and far off, it crept in below the hum of the air conditioning, a steady, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat trapped inside the arch's metal bones. He froze, mop suspended in midair, straining to catch it again. There, yes, it was unmistakable. Low, resonant, it thrummed in the hollow spaces, an almost imperceptible vibration that set the hair on his arms standing. Faint and far off, it crept in below the hum of the air conditioning, a steady, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat trapped inside the arch's metal bones. He froze, mop suspended in midair, straining to catch it again. There, yes, it was unmistakable. Low, resonant, it thrummed in the hollow spaces, an almost imperceptible vibration that set the hair on his arms standing. Leaving the mop, Elliot crept closer to the north leg of the arch. The pulse grew louder, a visceral throb that made his bones vibrate. Pressing his hand to the cold steel, he expected to feel the beat beneath his fingertips. But the surface was cool, impassive, still. The logical part of his brain screamed for explanations. Maybe it was an electrical glitch, maybe a minor seismic hiccup, maybe even some flaw in the arch's structure, but another part of him, the part that saw through noise to patterns, pulsed with a strange, exhilarating dread. The arch felt alive. "Excuse me," a sharp voice sliced through his thoughts, jolting him. He spun around, heart pounding. A woman stood before him in a severe black suit, her expression as unreadable as the thick government file clutched in her hand. Her eyes, sharp as knives, pinned him to the spot. She looked 50-ish, hair trimmed close, face etched with lines that said she'd seen things that didn't bear repeating. "What exactly are you doing, Mr. Reese?" she asked, each word crisp and calculated. Elliot stammered, fumbling for something, anything that sounded sane. I heard something," he managed, cursing how stupid that sounded, especially as he stood with his ear practically glued to the arch's metal flank. "This area is restricted," she said, her tone icy enough to chill the sweat on his neck. "I'll need to see your identification." With shaking hands, he fished out his badge, holding it out like a guilty confession. "Elliot Reese, janitor." She examined his ID with a slow, measured gaze that seemed to peel back layers of him. "And what exactly were you doing, Mr. Reese?" The lie fell out of his mouth before he could stop it. Just cleaning, Ma'am." Her eyes narrowed, a glint of something flickering beneath her calm exterior. "I see," she said, though her tone implied anything but. "Well, Mr. Reese, I can assure you that the arch is perfectly sound. Perhaps you misheard something." He knew she was lying. He could see it in the tight set of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the folder like it was a grenade. I must have been mistaken," he mumbled, feeling like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. She handed back his ID, her stare lingering for a beat longer than necessary. "Dr. Lena Alvarez," she said, introducing herself as if it were an afterthought. "My role is to oversee the integrity of this national monument." He gave a nod, desperately trying to read her face. Her gaze was as blank as the walls around them. "Keep to your duties, Mr. Reese," she said, her tone softening, though it did nothing to ease the weight of her gaze. "The floors need mopping, the trash bins need emptying. That's your responsibility. Understood?" "Understood, ma'am," he replied, swallowing his frustration. Her eyes stayed on him for a heartbeat longer, then she nodded, her lips tight and turned, heels echoing across the marble. He watched her walk away, feeling a strange mixture of resentment and intrigue settle over him. There was something in her eyes, a glimmer of knowledge, a hint of something she was keeping buried. As he resumed his cleaning, Elliot couldn't shake the memory of that hum, that strange pulsing beat that seemed to emanate from the arch's core. He went through his routine on autopilot, but his mind buzzed with questions, the remnants of that pulse lingering in his head like an unanswered prayer. Elliot knew one thing for certain: he hadn't been mistaken, and Dr. Alvarez wasn't telling him everything. The days that followed Elliot's midnight run-in with Dr. Alvarez felt like slipping through a fractured reality. Every corner of the arch seemed haunted by that infernal pulsing hum, a ghost sound that taunted him, wedged deep in his brain like some spectral parasite. Mopping floors, emptying trash bins, wiping down the vast, sterile surfaces of America's gleaming monument. His hands went through the motions, but his mind was hopelessly lost, unraveling threads that refused to make a tidy tapestry. That pulse was like a warning, a siren song luring him back. And while it never returned to haunt the arch's corridors, its phantoms still gnawed at him, keeping him up at night, invading his dreams. He became a hunter of expressions, scanning every face in a suit that passed through the lobby, searching for that telltale flicker of recognition, the slightest tremor that betrayed knowledge of what lay beneath the monument's metallic skin. It was a week later, 1 week exactly when the dam finally broke. Elliot was in the thick of the night shift, the arch eerily empty except for a handful of sleepy-eyed guards and the usual nocturnal critters scurrying about outside. He was just rounding a corner, pushing his battered cart along the polished floors, when he spotted her. Alvarez. She was gliding down the hallway, severe and sure, her footsteps silent, her gaze fixed like a laser on the restricted door ahead. Elliot's heart lurched. She was moving with a purpose, her face unreadable, and the heavy door seemed to swallow her whole. As it sealed with a faint beep, he stared after her, adrenaline prickling his veins. What in God's name was she doing back there this late? The answer was obvious: secrets, and secrets that Big begged to be uncovered. He abandoned his cart, nerves sizzling, his pulse hammering loud enough to drown out the faint hum of the arch's mechanical hum. A creeping thrill and a bone-deep dread twisted together in his gut as he approached the door, glancing over his shoulder before pressing his ear to the cool metal. Dead silence. His hand hovered over the handle, fingers twitching, every sensible cell in his brain screaming for him to walk away. But he couldn't resist. Not after everything, not after that encounter, those strange words. One last look down the corridor, a deep breath, and then he turned the handle, slipping through as the door clicked shut behind him. Inside was a narrow, dim corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The air felt thick, humming with some barely contained energy. At the far end of the hallway, another door loomed, and from behind it he could hear a faint, low hum, the same hum that had haunted him, that heartbeat in the arch's metal bones. His feet carried him forward, compelled, until he was face to face with the door. He paused, hand shaking as he gripped the handle. The room beyond was like stepping into the future, or maybe some twisted reimagining of the past. The walls were lined with high-tech equipment, every screen flickering with streams of data, scrolling glyphs and symbols straight out of ancient, forgotten languages. It was a symphony of the impossible, a testament to secrets buried so deep the world had long since forgotten. And there, at the center of the room, stood a console, a sleek obsidian slab decorated with buttons and switches that glowed faintly in the dim light. But what drew him in, what had his hand stretching out on its own, was the pulsing blue light at its core, beating with that same hypnotic rhythm he'd heard that first night. Against every rational thought he reached out, fingers brushing the console. And that was all it took. In an instant the room erupted in a blinding array of light and sound. The screens blazed, symbols spinning faster, faster, until they blurred into an incomprehensible torrent. His eyes caught a message scrawled across one screen, words that felt like they'd been burned directly into his brain. Andronian response initiated. Awaiting final verification. Andronian? The word was alien, foreign, and carried with it 1,000 unspoken implications. The weight of it pressed down on him, pinning him to the spot, his mind racing to keep up. Was it a government code? A warning? Or was it something older, darker? Before he could begin to untangle the implications, a voice like ice water on a hot flame sliced through the chaos. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Elliot whipped around, his stomach dropping as he faced Dr. Alvarez. Her face was hard, jaw set in an unbreakable line, eyes blazing with a fury that made his blood run cold. I didn't mean to," he stammered, backing away from the console, his heart slamming against his ribs. But Alvarez was already moving, crossing the distance in a few long strides. She grabbed his arm, her fingers like steel clamps, eyes fixed on him with a deadly intensity. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" she hissed, voice low and razor-sharp. "You've compromised everything, a classified operation. You've put everything at risk." The accusation hit like a punch, but his mind refused to stop spinning. He looked into her eyes, desperate for answers, the 1,000 questions coiling tighter. "What is this place?" he choked out, barely able to keep his voice steady. "What are you doing here?" For a second her grip loosened, a flicker of something pity crossing her face before it hardened again. "You've stumbled onto something, Mr. Reese," she said, voice barely a whisper, tinged with something dark and unnameable. "Something you couldn't possibly understand." He swallowed hard. "Then help me understand," he said, voice shaking but defiant. "What truth is this? What does Andronian mean?" Alvarez sighed, her eyes dark, filled with a weariness that seemed to go back centuries. "The truth," she said softly, her voice hollow, "about our past, about our future, about things humanity was never meant to know." Her words hung heavy in the air, sinking into his bones. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Alvarez shook her head, her eyes studying him, seeing something he couldn't grasp. "Knowledge like this has a price, Mr. Reese," she said, voice barely above a murmur. "And I'm not sure you're ready to pay it." He stared at her, heart pounding, caught between terror and the thrill of revelation. "What price?" She glanced down, a bitter smile flickering across her face. "The price of truth," she said, voice low and steady. "The price of seeing things you can never unsee, of understanding things humanity was never meant to know. The price of becoming part of something far larger than yourself." She paused in the doorway, her face cast in shadow, her expression unreadable. "I'm giving you a choice, Mr. Reese. You can walk away, pretend none of this happened. Go back to your life, your studies, your dreams of stars." His heart raced, the pull of the unknown crackling in his chest. "Or," she continued, her voice barely audible, "you can join us, help uncover the truth. But know this, once you cross that threshold, there's no going back. Your life will never be the same." With that, she slipped out, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click, leaving him alone in the buzzing silence. He stared at the console, the blue light's hypnotic beat calling him forward. The message seared into his mind. Andronian response initiated, awaiting final verification. His hands shook, every nerve tingling with fear and excitement, his whole world spinning around the question that could no longer be ignored. He knew, with a certainty that reached down to his bones, that he would press that button. And in that moment, as his fingers hovered over the console, Elliot Reese stepped into the unknown. The days that followed were a god-forsaken blur of dread and sleepless nights, the kind of feeling that claws at the base of your skull and won't let go. Elliot moved through his shifts like a ghost, mopping floors, cleaning windows, all with the twitchy, hollow-eyed look of a man who'd peered too far over the edge. That message burned behind his eyes, branded into his brain. Andronian response initiated, awaiting final verification. He didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't forget it if he tried. Every night he lay in his shoebox of an apartment, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, mind twisted in knots, spiraling through 1,000 half-baked theories. The Andronians, who were they? And why in God's name did they care about Earth? What was the point of the Arch's hidden control room and that pulsing blue light? Every question just led to another, a maze of possibilities that grew darker the deeper he went. Elliot thought about throwing in the towel, quitting the Arch, leaving the whole damn mess behind. just slinking back to his old life, grad school drudgery, bills stacking up, scraping by on the crumbs academia threw his way. But deep down, he knew it was hopeless. That door was open, the words had been spoken, and there was no going back. Alvarez's warning echoed in his mind, taunting him. Once a door is opened, there's no closing it. So he did the only thing he knew how to do: research. Hours upon hours hunched over his laptop, diving headfirst into every conspiracy forum, every dusty library PDF, every fringe site cluttered with shaky claims and half-sane theories. He scoured ancient texts, from the Sumerians' barely decipherable cuneiform to the crumbling codices of the Mayans. There were whispers everywhere he looked, faint outlines of a global disaster, like a scar that ran deep beneath the fabric of history. Civilizations wiped out, swallowed by forces they couldn't control. There was a name for it, repeated like a death chant across time and place: the Great Sleep. Elliot's heart raced as he pieced it together. The Sumerians called it the Great Deluge. The Mayans prophesied the end of the world. The Hopi warned of the coming of the Fourth World. Cultures thousands of miles apart, centuries separating them, yet all humming the same dark refrain. It was too coincidental to ignore. He'd seen it too many times. Easter Island's Moai staring blankly into the sea, the Nazca lines slashed across the Peruvian desert, the towering pyramids of Egypt, all monuments, all warning signs. It hit him like a punch to the gut. These ancient sites weren't just relics of lost civilizations. They were markers, beacons, a global puzzle designed to outlast the ravages of time. He could see it clear as day, a network of monuments stretching across continents, waiting to be decoded. The weight of it crashed over him. The arch wasn't just some monument to westward expansion. It was part of a network, an ancient message ringing through the ages, and he'd been handed the keys. He remembered the pulsing blue light, the cryptic message, that strange otherworldly hum. Andronians, whoever or whatever they were, had left behind a signal, a warning. It wasn't just a signal, it was a final damnation for anyone fool enough to ignore it. The thought should have terrified him, and it did. Every cell in his body was screaming at him to stop, to run. But a grim determination settled over him like a shroud. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was a mission, a calling, something primal that had latched onto his bones and refused to let go. He'd been chosen for this by fate or by chance. The doors had been unlocked, and he was going to walk through, come hell or high water. He thought of Alvarez, the steel in her gaze, the words she'd left him with. He could leave, turn his back on it all, let the mystery rot, let his mind chew on the what-ifs for the rest of his life. Or he could step into the unknown, dig deeper, take on the burden he was born to carry. There really wasn't a choice, was there? With a deep breath, he clenched his fists, setting his mind like a flint. He'd keep the job, keep his eyes open, his ears to the ground. He'd search out others who shared his hunger for the truth, allies in the shadows who'd be willing to help him rip the veil from this twisted reality. Because somewhere out there, buried under the rubble of history, were the answers he was clawing for. The truth about the Andronians, the monuments, and the nightmare of the Great Sleep. He wasn't ready for what lay ahead, but he was damn sure going to try. In that dingy apartment, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and stacks of musty books, Elliot felt the weight of his decisions settle on him like a lead blanket. There was a storm brewing on the horizon, but for the first time in his life, he felt alive, his pulse beating in time with the pulsing hum he'd heard that fateful night. He'd crossed the threshold, burned the bridges, Whatever the cost, he'd pay it. The nights were long, the whiskey short, and Elliot's world had turned into one dark, twisted fever dream. Every routine, every minor task now had the electric charge of a loaded gun, a reminder that he was neck-deep in secrets that could flatten the fragile house of cards called civilization. And every time he closed his eyes, his dreams throbbed with visions of ancient ruins and warnings scrawled across time. He couldn't shake it, the Andronians, the monuments, the great sleep, each whispering to him like an unholy trinity of doom. And then, late one night, there was a knock at his door. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, sharp and deliberate, like the tap of a judge's gavel. He knew it was her even before he'd turned the handle, heart jackhammering as he let her in. Dr. Lena Alvarez, in that grim black suit, her eyes cutting through him like glass. No wasted words, no pretense, no buffer for the truth that was about to turn his life inside out. "May I come in, Mr. Reese?" Her voice was smooth, unyielding as a blade. Elliot nodded, stepping aside. This was it, the moment his whole twisted, spiraling journey had dragged him toward. She stepped in, moving with a precision that bordered on machine-like, her gaze stripping the room down, cataloguing every coffee-stained note, every errant conspiracy book. "You know why I'm here," she said, not even a question, more like she was stating the obvious. Elliot's throat went dry. "The Andronians," he managed, barely above a whisper. A thin smile curled Alvarez's lips, but it was as warm as ice. "Good, you've been busy." She reached into her jacket, pulling out a small, featureless black drive, sleek as a pistol, and set it on the table between them. "What you saw in the arch was only the beginning, Mr. Reese." He stared at the drive, every nerve on edge. "What's this?" "An invitation," she said, cold and calm. "For decades, my organization, The Veil, has been intercepting the Andronians' messages, decoding fragments they left in monuments across the globe, warnings embedded in humanity's most ancient sites." The words hit like a freight train. "The Veil?" he muttered, brain struggling to keep pace. She nodded, her voice measured. "We're a covert operation tasked with monitoring extraterrestrial signals and protecting this world from what lies beyond it. And you, Mr. Reese, we've been watching you since your little escapade in the arch. Your knowledge of symbols and patterns has not gone unnoticed." A chill raced down his spine, the weight of her words heavy as lead. "So why me? Why now?" "Because we need you," Alvarez replied, her gaze hard as iron. "The Andronian messages are riddled with codes, encrypted in layers that only a mind like yours can begin to unravel. They aren't just monitoring us, Mr. Reese. They're assessing us." It was all slamming into place now. The arch, the ancient sites, the endless warning of the great sleep, pieces of some enormous puzzle he'd only begun to glimpse. "What exactly have you found?" he asked, forcing the words past the knot of fear tightening in his throat. She lifted the drive, fingers turning it in the dim light. "The Andronians have been watching our development, our progress, if you can call it that. These messages we're piecing together, they indicate we're at a critical juncture. They're assessing our fitness as a species, whether we're worth preserving." Elliot stared, his mind reeling as she plugged the drive into his computer. Symbols and glyphs flooded the screen, twisting and dancing like shadows with a mind of their own, taunting him with the riddle of a lifetime. "It's like their language is alive," Alvarez said, her voice low and solemn. "It hides as much as it reveals, a test within a test. But what we do know is this: they're warning us of a coming reckoning, an event they call a final assessment." His eyes were locked on the screen, the symbols dizzying, tantalizingly close yet stubbornly out of reach. "The great sleep," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Alvarez nodded, her face stony. "Yes, it's a fate that's claimed civilization after civilization, a judgment handed down by the Andronians on those who failed their assessment. The Arch, the Giza pyramids, the statues of Easter Island, they all bear the marks of these lost cultures, each a final, desperate message on the edge of extinction." A nauseating wave of dread washed over him, the vastness of it threatening to crack his mind wide open. "And now it's our turn," he muttered, voice barely audible. Alvarez placed a cold hand on his shoulder, firm, unyielding. "Yes, Mr. Reese, the Andronians have started their response, the final leg of their evaluation. We have a narrow window to prove we're worth saving, to demonstrate that we've learned from the mistakes of those who came before." Elliot's mind whirred, possibilities colliding in a mad rush. The entire fate of humanity, hanging by a thread, all based on their ability to decipher these alien messages, to make sense of a language that seemed to defy comprehension. "So, what do we do?" he asked, barely able to keep the tremor out of his voice. Alvarez's eyes hardened, a glint of resolve sparking in their depths. "We work, Mr. Reese. We pore over every data fragment, decode every symbol, pull meaning from every line of Andronian script. The Arch is only one piece of the puzzle, a node in a vast network that encircles the globe. We have to find the others, interpret their messages, and convince the Andronians that we are capable of evolving." The enormity of it made him feel sick, but he knew there was only one answer. He wasn't just on a path anymore. He was on a collision course with something far larger than himself, and there was no room for hesitation. "I'm in," he said, voice solid, conviction settling over him like armor. "Whatever it takes, whatever the cost, I'll help you decipher this. I'll help you save us from the great sleep." Alvarez's lips quirked into a cold, calculating smile, one that made his skin crawl. "I knew you would, Mr. Reese. Welcome to the Vale. Your real journey begins now." With that, she turned and strode out of his apartment, leaving him alone with a silent computer screen filled with alien symbols and a burden that weighed like the entire world. The stakes were beyond comprehension, but Elliot Reese was done being afraid. He rolled up his sleeves, set his eyes on the glowing screen, and plunged in. Elliot's life had gone from grey to pure, blinding chaos. The Vale was no longer some nebulous concept. It was a shadow around every corner, a static crackle in every phone call, a chill running down his spine every time he looked over his shoulder. Working with Dr. Alvarez had pulled him into a world where secrets stacked on secrets. Allies wore the faces of enemies, and enemies could be anyone at all. But there was no going back, not now. The Vale's enforcers, the Vale's private boogeymen, seemed to haunt him everywhere he went, never seen, always sensed. They were the elite, the last line of silence, there to ensure the public never heard a word of the Andronian puzzle. So every step he took with Alvarez felt like wading into a trap. But they had no choice. They pored over every shard of the Andronian language, hunched over cryptic glyphs and ancient codes in cramped, shadowy rooms, praying for a crack in the riddle. Then came Jude. He appeared out of the ether like a stray radio signal, all wiry limbs, wild hair, and the manic spark of someone who'd seen too much and wasn't sure he'd come out sane. They met him in a corner booth of a dingy internet cafe, surrounded by the kind of crowd that knew not to ask questions. "I hear you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," he said with a smirk, tapping away on a laptop covered in battered stickers. His voice was low, just a murmur under the din of clacking keyboards. "I think you and I could help each other out." Elliot and Alvarez were ready to pull out, hands hovering near the concealed weapons they now carried at all times. But Jude flashed a crooked grin, holding up his hands. "Easy there, I'm not here to make trouble. Quite the opposite, in fact." Jude was no ordinary hacker. He was a maestro of surveillance and secrecy, a rogue agent with fingers in all the digital cracks that kept the Vale's walls intact. The man had spent years piecing together Andronian fragments from the odd leak or a lucky break in the Vale's firewalls. "I can see the pieces," he said, voice electric, fingers flying across the keys. "But it's like assembling a puzzle in the dark without the faintest clue of the final picture. That's where you two come in." Skeptical, yes, but they had no choice. Jude brought with him a treasure trove of encrypted Andronian symbols, hidden files, and high-voltage information that could turn the tide. For the first time they saw a glimmer of real progress. And with him came another crucial piece, Carla. Carla was the academic prodigy the Vale had reeled in straight out of grad school, a linguistic savant with the ability to crack languages as easily as breathing. But as she waded deeper into the Andronian files, she saw the twisted underbelly of the Vale's operation. She saw the information hoarding, the secrets stashed away under lock and key, the iron-fisted enforcement of silence. And when Elliot and Alvarez reached out, she hesitated only a moment before joining forces. So, the four of them, the dreamer, the spy, the hacker, and the linguist, became an unlikely band of rebels, slipping through the Vale's cracks and putting together the forbidden language of the Andronians, one fragment at a time. The network of ancient monuments revealed itself piece by piece, each structure emitting its own unique frequency. When aligned, they formed a global protective field, a delicate shield that had kept Earth out of some cosmic firing line for millennia. But the Andronian messages held a darker, heavier truth, a warning that it wasn't humanity's scientific progress or technological prowess they cared about. No, the Andronians had their eyes on humanity's ethical choices, its treatment of the world, its respect for the fragile balance of life. The monuments were a record of judgment, echoes of civilizations that had failed and paid the price in the form of the Great Sleep, a cosmic stasis that had wiped them clean off the map. The four of them were huddled over their research late one night when the hammer fell. A knock, a rustle, a faint whisper on the edge of hearing. The enforcers were closing in. The quiet threat became an ever-present shadow, driving them from one hideout to the next, barely staying a step ahead of the enforcers' cold, methodical pursuit. But, as dangerous as it was, Elliot had never felt more alive. He'd traded the dull ache of academic ennui for a white-hot purpose, a reason to press on no matter how thin the air or how close the danger. In the end, there was no choice but one final play. With the Vale closing in and their time running thin, they gathered at the Arch, the birthplace of this entire nightmare. Jude had set up a makeshift control center, wires and equipment rigged around them in a desperate bid to activate the Andronian tech buried within the Arch's bones. Elliot watched the seconds tick down on his watch as the enforcers swept in like a wall of black armor, every movement cold, efficient, and unforgiving. The four of them fought like hell. Every trick, every ounce of training and raw survival instinct was thrown at the enforcers. But they held their ground, barely enough to keep their fingers on the keyboards and their focus on the pulsing blue light that flickered into life at the heart of the Arch. And then, at the last, impossibly desperate second, the Arch began to glow. a pulsating hum rising in pitch until it matched the frequencies of the other monuments around the world. Like an unholy symphony, the other sites came to life, energy crackling as the monuments synchronized, their power coalescing until it bent reality itself. Elliot felt it, a surge, a rush of energy that seemed to reach into his chest and twist his heart. They'd done it. The message had been activated, the ancient warning broadcast, out into the universe. The Veil's walls were shattered, the Andronian code unleashed, its light flashing across the world. But as the glow dimmed and the echoes of that alien hum faded, Elliot knew it wasn't over. The Veil would come after them, relentless in their quest to silence this knowledge, to drag humanity back into the dark. And the Andronian's judgment, still looming a cosmic sword of Damocles ready to fall. He looked at his team, faces battered, exhausted, but alive, and felt a swell of determination. Whatever came next, whatever fight lay ahead, they would face it together. They'd shattered the illusion, and now there was no going back. The safe house was thick with tension, the air so heavy with the knowledge of their next moves that it practically vibrated. They'd barely made it out of the arch alive, and now Elliot, Alvarez, Jude, and Carla were huddled together in some forgotten corner of nowhere, reeling from what they'd learned, the Andronian network, the ancient monuments, and the gnawing threat of the Great Sleep. It all painted a picture that was both wondrous and horrifying. It was the kind of revelation that didn't just shake your worldview, it blew the whole thing to hell. The more they sifted through the Andronian lore, the uglier it got. The Great Sleep wasn't a natural disaster or an extinction event. It was worse, a cosmic stasis, a trap of suspended consciousness that snared entire civilizations in a never-ending silence. No thoughts, no dreams, just a blank eternity. This was the fate that had swallowed up the Sumerians, the Mayans, the Babylonians, societies that had been warned just as humanity was being warned, and yet had done nothing. Their arrogance, ignorance, and disbelief had sentenced them to a silent death, and now humanity was next in line. It was a truth too heavy to fully process, but there was no time to linger in horror. They were up against the clock, every tick bringing them closer to humanity's reckoning. They tore through the Andronian texts, deciphering every cryptic fragment, driven by a desperate need to figure out the final piece of this puzzle. And yet, the more they uncovered, the closer they got to a grim reality. The Veil, their so-called ally, wasn't looking to save humanity, it was trying to control it. Dr. Alvarez had spent years serving the Veil, putting her trust in their mission, but now, as she dissected the Andronian mystery alongside Elliot and the others, her faith began to erode. The Veil's obsession with secrecy, its ruthless enforcement arm, the enforcers. They weren't interested in the truth. They wanted obedience, power, the control to dictate what humanity should and shouldn't know. The Veil's goals had twisted into something dark, and Alvarez could see it now, clear as day. One night, as they crowded around a dimly lit table, sifting through the latest fragment of Andronian text, Alvarez finally spoke up. She'd been staring at the data for hours, silent, eyes narrowed with that fierce concentration that Elliot had come to recognize, but now there was something else there, doubt, raw, and unfiltered. "We're almost out of time," she muttered, her voice barely breaking a whisper. "The Veil. They're not going to let us finish this. They'll bury us alive if it means keeping their control." They all looked up, knowing the truth even before she'd said it. They'd sensed it, felt the cold, creeping realization that the Veil was becoming their enemy. But to hear it from Alvarez herself, to see the anger and fear in her eyes, it hit like a punch to the gut. "What do we do?" Jude asked, fingers tapping out a jittery rhythm on the table. "We can't just stop. We can't let them win." Alvarez's face hardened, her voice low and steady. "We don't stop. We finish this no matter the cost. If the Veil tries to stop us, we fight back." Silence fell over the table as the weight of her words settled on them. It was madness, this plan to go toe-to-toe with a shadow organization built on secrets and ruthlessness, an organization that could disappear them without a trace. But they all knew it was the only way. And as Elliot looked around, he saw the same determination on every face, a willingness to stare down the veil, to risk everything for the truth. The next 48 hours were a mad, chaotic blur. They barely slept, scraping together fragments of Andronian lore, decoding symbols until their eyes blurred. There was a fierce intensity in their work, an urgency that pressed down on them like a physical weight. They had no choice but to push forward, no time to waste if they were going to get humanity's message out before the veil silenced them for good. Carla was the first to notice the change. The messages were shifting, becoming frantic, sharper with every passing hour. It was as if the Andronians were screaming from across the cosmos, an urgent call that humanity was on the brink of blowing its last chance. "They're warning us," she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up from her laptop. "The window is closing fast. If we don't act now..." She trailed off, but the meaning hung heavy in the air. If they failed, if they allowed this to slip by, humanity's fate was sealed. Elliot felt a wave of dread wash over him. They were running out of time, and failure meant the kind of oblivion that made death look like a sweet release. But even as that fear gnawed at him, he felt a hard, unbreakable core of resolve. They'd been chosen for this, each of them with their unique skills, perfectly placed to decipher the Andronian warnings and do what countless other civilizations had failed to do. He looked to Alvarez, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She'd made her choice, cast her lot with them against the veil, knowing full well the risks. "We keep going," he said, his voice a steely echo of Alvarez's resolve. "No matter what happens, no matter who tries to stop us, we finish this." The others nodded, faces set with a grim determination. They'd already gone too far to turn back. They'd seen the darkness, felt the weight of knowledge too great to ignore. They would follow this path to the bitter end, fight whatever came their way, and drag humanity, kicking and screaming back from the edge of the great sleep. As dawn's first light crept through the windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the room, Elliot took a breath, his thoughts coiled like a spring. They'd reached the inmost cave, the final leg of the journey where the stakes couldn't be higher, where the risks eclipsed anything they'd imagined. There were no guarantees, no promises of success, just the cold, hard fact that they had to try. He looked at each of them, his friends, his allies, knowing they were all ready to face whatever came next. For the sake of the world, for the slimmest chance at a future, they'd unravel the Andronian secrets, heed the cosmic warnings, and do whatever it took to save humanity from oblivion. He turned toward the sunrise, ready for whatever nightmare lay ahead. The road was dangerous, the future bleak, but with his team beside him, he'd face it all head on. Together, they'd give it everything they had, or die trying. And as the morning light grew, casting its fragile hope over their grim faces, Elliot knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. They would follow this twisted path to its bitter end, no matter where it led. Sunlight cracked over the skyline as Elliot and his team steeled themselves in the safe house, faces drawn, minds buzzing with the high-octane rush of the impossible plan they were about to set in motion. They'd prepared all night, hammering out every detail, rehearsing each step until their nerves were raw. This wasn't some last-ditch attempt. This was it. The gateway arch loomed like a steel god in the distance, a fortress guarding the secrets of the Andronians, and they were about to rip it open. Elliot's voice was calm but edged as he looked to each of them. "One more time," he said. "Jude, you hack into the arch's security, take down the alarms, the cameras, anything that could give us away. Carla, you're with me to initiate the broadcast from the control room. Alvarez," he looked her in the eyes, the unspoken gravity of the task they were asking her to do hanging between them. "You keep the enforcers off us. Every second you buy is one we desperately need." Alvarez gave a curt nod, checking the clip on her pistol. "They'll be ready for trouble," she said, her voice steely. "But so am I. Don't expect a lot of time." Elliot's throat was dry as they left the safe house, splitting up in pairs and weaving through the city like shadows, slipping under the radar of the Veil's prying eyes. The closer they got to the arch, the higher the stakes felt, every footstep heavier with the knowledge that the future of humanity hung on their next moves. The arch stood gleaming in the early light, serene, indifferent to the chaos about to erupt within it. Jude led the way, fingers flying over his tablet as they slipped through the entrance and into the arch's depths, disabling systems with the practiced speed of someone who'd spent half his life in front of a screen. They snaked through corridors and bypassed security with minutes to spare, descending into the guts of the arch until they were finally at the door to the control room. The air was dense, thick with the kind of tension that sinks into your bones and stays there. And then, hell broke loose. A crackle on the comms, the Veil's enforcers clad in black body armor, their faces hidden behind dark visors, descended upon them like a pack of wolves. Alvarez sprang into action, firing round after round as she kept them at bay, dodging down the corridor and drawing their fire with the kind of focus that only desperation could breed. "Move!" she shouted over her shoulder. Elliot and Carla dashed into the control room, hands shaking as they scrambled to the console. Every keystroke felt like it dragged, each second ticking by like a taunt. But just as they were getting into the final phase of the broadcast sequence, a scream tore through the silence. Jude. Carla's face twisted in horror as she saw him hit the ground, laptop skidding across the floor. "Jude!" she cried, lunging forward, but Elliot caught her arm, his grip iron. "Don't. He wouldn't want it to end here. We're so close." With tears streaking her face, Carla nodded, snapping back to the task, her fingers moving with renewed fury. Alvarez was a blur of movement in the hallway, her weapon flashing as she fought off wave after wave of enforcers, but even she couldn't hold them all back. Elliot saw her take a hit to the shoulder, her face contorted in pain as she staggered. The console spat out error after error, system firewalls clamping down like iron jaws. It felt like a death sentence. They'd come all this way, risked everything, only to crash against the Veil's last line of defense. But then, a miracle. The screen flashed green, Andronian symbols flooding the display in a dizzying array. The broadcast had initiated, their message unleashed into the world. A shout of triumph caught in Elliot's throat, his heart pounding as the reality of what they'd done sank in. But celebration would have to wait. The enforcers, realizing what had happened, were charging with renewed force, weapons blazing. Alvarez, blood dripping down her arm, turned to them, her voice sharp with command. "Get out! Now! I'll hold them here!" Elliot hesitated, every nerve in his body screaming against leaving her behind. But the fire in her eyes left no room for argument. "Don't let this be for nothing!" she shouted, her voice fierce, unbreakable. Gripping Carla's hand, Elliot ran, their footsteps echoing in the corridors as they sprinted through the arch's labyrinthine halls, the sound of gunfire and shouts fading behind them. They stumbled out into the bright morning light, gasping, battered but alive. A surge of loss and grief washed over Elliot as he thought of Jude, of Alvarez still fighting alone in the depths of the arch, giving everything for the slim chance that their message would make a difference. But that grief was tempered by something else, a flicker of hope, a purpose burning like a wildfire. The Andronian's warning was now spreading, racing across screens and airwaves, sinking into the collective consciousness. The world was watching, and for the first time the power of that truth felt greater than the might of the veil. There would be others out there who heard the message and took it to heart. Scientists, activists, people who would rise up in the face of oblivion and fight for a better future. They were not alone. This was bigger than them now. As Elliot and Carla made their way through the awakening city, bruised but resolute, he knew they had started a chain reaction, one that couldn't be stopped. They had cracked open the truth, thrust it into the light, and now humanity would have to confront it head-on. The Andronian warning was a rallying cry, and even as fear twisted in his stomach, Elliot knew that somewhere, somehow, humanity had a fighting chance. The road ahead would be dark, the forces stacked against them vast and powerful, but Elliot and his team had shown the world a glimpse of what was possible. As long as there was breath in his body, he'd fight for that future, for those they'd lost, for those still fighting, for a world that had just been given the keys to its own salvation. They would face it all. They'd die trying if they had to, but they would not back down. This was the beginning of a new fight, and Elliot would be there, standing in the front lines, no matter where this cosmic gamble led. They had set fire to the future, and now it was up to humanity to decide what it would do with the light. The Andronian broadcast hit the world like a bullet to the brainstem, ripping apart humanity's comfortable illusions with the ferocity of a storm. Riots exploded across cities like wildfire. Streets burned, stores were looted, and the air buzzed with panic, the primal desperation of people who had just glimpsed the razor's edge they'd been dancing on. Governments reeled, trying to rein in the chaos, but it was like trying to plug a dam with bare hands. People had seen too much, heard too much, and there was no going back. But even as fear fueled the violence, there were those who heard the Andronian message as something else, a challenge, a warning. Environmental activists who'd spent years being dismissed as doomsday prophets found their voices amplified, their warnings about ecological collapse and humanity's destructive ways now validated by an alien civilization. They went from fringe to front stage overnight, catapulted into the global spotlight with a vengeance. In the ivory towers and back rooms of power, politicians scrambled to understand the broadcast's meaning, drafting teams of cryptographers and linguists to untangle the alien language, every line, every symbol, a potential lifeline. Humanity was up against it, and the answers they needed were buried in codes and warnings from beings far beyond their understanding. Elliot and his team were the eye of the storm, their every move scrutinized, dissected by a world desperate for someone to blame or someone to save them. Heroes to some, villains to others, they were the messengers bearing the weight of an entire species' future. And in the middle of it all was Dr. Alvarez, with one foot in each world. The Veil, her old employer and new adversary, saw an opportunity and offered her a way out, denounce Elliot and his team, play along with the narrative, and she'd get amnesty, a return to her old life. But Alvarez was no pawn. She'd seen the Veil's darkness firsthand, seen the grip they held on the truth, and she wasn't about to let herself be pulled back into their shadow. With grim resolve, she turned her back on them for good and doubled down on the only path that mattered, deciphering the Andronian message. The clock was ticking, and they weren't about to let a shadow organization bury them or the truth. Days bled into nights as she and Elliot pored over every Andronian fragment they had, each symbol, each line, combing through it all like miners digging for gold. Exhaustion gnawed at them, the stakes pressing down like lead, but they pushed on. And then they found it, a final line embedded in the message, a line that cut through the noise and the fear with brutal simplicity. Those who fail to balance existence shall face the great sleep. The translation was like a bomb dropped into a world already ablaze. There it was, written in alien code. Humanity's existence was on the line, and its survival hung on its ability to put the brakes on its own self-destruction. No otherworldly catastrophe would take them out, no meteor or supernova. Humanity's demise would come at its own hands if it couldn't shift the scales. For Elliot and Alvarez, the revelation was both a victory and a chain around their necks. They'd gotten the message out, but now they bore the burden of what came next. The Andronian warning wasn't just a prophecy, it was a ticking clock, and they were holding the timer. They could see it, plain as day. This was humanity's final act, and the future hinged on whether it could rise to the challenge or fall to pieces. The chaos roared on around them, but in the wake of their message, something else began to stir. People were listening. Environmentalists, scientists, activists. They saw the truth in the Andronian warning and seized it. Protesters flooded streets with renewed purpose, demanding change from corporations, calling out the governments that kept profits at the expense of life. A movement took root, swelling with the fury of billions who wanted a future that didn't end in oblivion. Elliot and Alvarez found themselves at the helm of a growing army, their voices sparking fires across continents. They weren't just fighting the Veil anymore. They were fighting every power structure built on greed and ignorance, every institution that looked at a warning from across the stars and shrugged. And as the people rallied, as voices rose in solidarity with a cause they could no longer ignore, even the Veil began to fracture. Some of their operatives, hardened agents who'd seen things that would crush ordinary men, started to question their orders, to wonder if they'd been on the wrong side all along. It was no clean revolution, no neat change of hands. The Veil fought to the end, clawing at their control, trying to choke the message before it could take root too deeply. But Elliot and Alvarez were past the point of fear. They'd already lost too much to stop now. In the weeks that followed, the Andronian message became a rallying cry. They'd started a fire, and it was spreading. Grassroots organizations sprang up in corners of the world that had been silent for too long, their voices rising together in defiance, in demand for a new path. The pressure was mounting, and governments began to crumble under it, forced to acknowledge the voice of the people and shift policies towards something that might, just might, give humanity a fighting chance. The darkness hadn't lifted. The great sleep still hovered on the edge of everything, a shadow waiting to swallow humanity if it failed. But for the first time, Elliot felt something break free, a sliver of hope. They had ignited something real, something alive. And as he and Alvarez stood at the center of the storm, surrounded by people who were waking up to the fight of their lives, he knew they had a chance, slim as it was. The odds were staggering, the forces against them powerful. But with the strength of conviction, the courage to face the truth, they could turn the tide. The Great Sleep was waiting, but so were they. The Andronian message had dropped like a live grenade into a world full of gasoline. Everywhere you looked, it was chaos, a frenzy of scrambling officials, panicked citizens, and power-hungry corporations clawing to get a handle on the crisis, each trying to twist the alien warning to their own ends. Earth had become a hive of desperation, every player scrambling for control as the Great Sleep loomed closer. For Elliot and Alvarez, that chaos was just the beginning. They pushed the message of balance and unity at every turn, fighting to cut through the noise, but the threats grew sharper and closer by the day. It was only a matter of time before the Veil moved in for the kill. The hit came fast, a surgical strike, a team of black-clad enforcers storming their safe house, guns drawn, expressions stone cold. In minutes it was over. Elliot and Alvarez cuffed, gagged, and thrown into the back of a dark van, with only their thoughts and the hum of the engine to keep them company. The two of them vanished into a high-security facility, buried away from the public eye. Days blurred together in a hellish mix of interrogation rooms, sterile cells, and a revolving door of grim-faced operatives intent on breaking them. They tried every trick in the book, threats, isolation, mind games, desperate to force them to recant, to denounce the Andronian message as nothing but a hoax. But Elliot and Alvarez held firm, spirits bruised but unbreakable. The truth was out, and they weren't about to back down, not now. Weeks crawled by in that prison, time stretching out like a slow, grinding descent. But as the days dripped away, they started to notice a shift, a faint buzz of unrest in the air. Guards who once looked like faceless drones now whispered in huddles, their faces tight with worry. And then, one day, a new broadcast pierced the facility, echoing through the halls and flooding every monitor. It was the Andronians, responding to the mess humanity had made of things. Their words were just as cryptic, layered with meaning, impossible to decipher at a glance. Elliot and Alvarez strained to pass the message, minds racing, but it felt like trying to grasp smoke. But even if the message was murky, the effect it had outside was anything but. The world was on fire. Governments splintered under the pressure, leaders who'd once shaken hands and pledged cooperation, now pointing fingers, trading accusations, turning on each other in a bid for survival. The streets were alive with unrest. Those who'd once followed Elliot and Alvarez, caught in a free fall, split between those still clinging to hope and those who'd spiraled into paranoia and fury. Inside their cell, Elliot and Alvarez watched in frustration, knowing they'd let a genie out of the bottle with no way to put it back in. They'd brought the truth to light, sure, but they'd also ignited a powder keg of fear and division that could tear humanity apart, just as the Andronians' final judgment loomed overhead. It was Alvarez who finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper in the echo of their cell. "We knew it would come to this," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the grey, sterile floor. "We knew the price of truth wouldn't be cheap." Elliot nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a vice. "But we couldn't just sit back, pretend like it wasn't happening. The Andronians gave us this chance, this warning. We had to act, to try." Alvarez looked up, eyes blazing with the determination he'd come to know so well. "And we will keep trying. They can keep us in here forever if they want, but it won't change a thing. We'll fight until they have no choice but to listen." In that moment, Elliot felt an overwhelming surge of pride and loyalty for the woman beside him. They'd been through the ringer together, face down, the impossible, and here they were, side by side, even as their world crumbled. Whatever happened next, he knew he'd go down fighting with her. Days bled into weeks. The interrogations, the isolation, the grueling pressure tests, they withstood it all. holding on to each other and the shared purpose that had carried them this far. And then, one day, everything changed. The guards who dragged them from their cell that morning were silent, nervous. The sterile white walls gave way to daylight as they stepped outside, blinking into the glare, greeted by a world that had erupted while they'd been locked away. The veil, that secretive force of manipulation and power, had overplayed its hand. The public had seen enough, and world leaders who'd once cowered under the weight of the veil's influence now stood against it. Governments were finally rallying, pushing back against the shadow organization's grip on the truth. The veil's empire was collapsing, its secrets dragged into the light of day, its agents scattered, its strongholds dismantled. Elliot and Alvarez stepped back into a world transformed. The streets pulsed with life as people marched, their faces defiant, voices raised in a cry for change. It was a tidal wave of humanity, each person a spark in the inferno that had burned the old structures of power to ash. And as they moved through the crowd, Elliot felt a pulse of hope he hadn't dared to let himself believe in. But the fight was far from over. The great sleep still hovered on the edge of existence, an insidious reminder that humanity's time was short. The Andronian message was out, but it was up to the people of Earth to take it seriously, to stop fighting each other and focus on the balance that the message demanded. They'd cracked open the truth, but now they had to drive it home, to pull humanity back from the edge with every ounce of strength they had. And so Elliot and Alvarez, their bodies battered but spirits unbroken, took to the streets with the people who shared their dream. They didn't sugarcoat it. The road ahead was brutal, and the forces they were up against were still strong. But they also knew that hope was a powerful thing, that humanity's spirit, when united, could defy the odds. Together they faced the darkness, determined to make the world hear the warning, see the path forward, and choose life over oblivion. For as long as it took, until the last breath, they would be there, pushing humanity toward the balance that would stave off the great sleep. For they were the last line, the ones willing to stare down oblivion, to claw for a future even when all seemed lost. And they would keep fighting, not because it was easy, not because victory was certain, but because it was the only choice that mattered. The world held its breath in the last moments before midnight. From sprawling cities to tiny villages, people crowded around screens, transfixed, waiting for the transmission that would decide their fate. Midnight struck, and every device on the planet lit up with a single, stark message. Balance or oblivion. Choice is yours. For a heartbeat, an uncanny silence fell over the earth, a calm so profound it seemed as if the planet itself had paused to consider the ultimatum. And then chaos erupted. Some people fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces, the weight of humanity's failures crashing over them in waves. Others stood defiant, fists raised, voices roar as they shouted their resolve to fight, to resist judgment by an alien force. Most simply sat in stunned silence, minds reeling, grappling with the magnitude of the choice that lay before them. Balance or oblivion. A clean, cruel binary that held the future of the species in its grip. Elliot and Alvarez were caught in the tidal wave of emotion, their own exhaustion and hope reflected in the millions of faces around them. They'd fought tooth and nail to bring the Andronian message to the world, but the hard work was far from over. Across every nation, cracks were forming. The fragile unity that had begun to take shape now fractured under the weight of personal agendas, as governments, corporations, and power brokers scrambled to secure their own positions in the face of oblivion. Corporations, no longer cornered by public outrage, doubled down on sowing confusion, deploying PR armies to undermine the Andronian message, assuring the public it was a hoax, a cosmic bluff. Governments, already buckling under pressure, began to fall apart, leaders casting suspicion at one another, the fragile alliances disintegrating in a flurry of mistrust. It was bedlam, human nature at its most desperate and its most defiant. But in the shadows of all that discord, something else was beginning to take root. Flickers of hope emerged, small at first, like faint stars fighting through the night, but growing stronger with each passing hour. People gathered in public squares, in parks, in crumbling meeting halls. They marched and chanted, raised signs and voices in unison, demanding change. They weren't waiting for leaders or corporate approval. This was a movement built on raw humanity, on the will of people who had seen their existence laid bare and knew that they couldn't go back. Everywhere groups mobilized. Calls went out for a new world, a world built on balance where nature and industry could coexist without tipping into ruin, where the planet itself was treated as an ally rather than an infinite resource. And slowly, like an incoming tide, the demand for change became impossible to ignore. Elliot and Alvarez watched from the eye of the storm, an overwhelming mix of pride and hope swelling in their chests as they saw the seeds they'd planted begin to sprout. They'd taken on an impossible mission, and now, in the heart of the chaos, they could see their work taking hold, pushing back against the darkness. Governments, finally swayed by public insistence, began shifting policies. Leaders who'd once laughed off climate reform now scrambled to pass emergency legislation. Even corporations found themselves forced to pivot, their empires of excess yielding to green energy and circular economies, adapting out of sheer survival. Yet for every victory there was another hurdle. The great sleep, the cosmic shadow of extinction, still hovered on the periphery, a grim reminder that failure was still very much on the table. And so, even as Elliot and Alvarez celebrated their progress, they knew the war was far from over. The world was listening, but there were still those who'd do anything to cling to the old ways, to bury the Andronian message under mountains of doubt and profit. As the days bled into weeks, it became clear that their battle was shifting. The revolution had gone global, and now they had to find their own place within it, to hold the line and keep the movement alive. They'd sparked the flame, but others would need to tend it, to push it forward until every inch of the planet felt the call. And so, Elliot and Alvarez prepared to part ways, knowing that their paths would diverge but that their shared mission remained. For Elliot, it meant returning to the world of academia, not as a quiet researcher, but as a mentor, a beacon for a generation growing up under the shadow of the Great Sleep. He'd teach the truths he'd fought so hard to uncover, arming young minds with the knowledge to keep pushing forward. In his last hours in St. Louis, he found himself once more at the foot of the Gateway Arch, the monument that had started it all. Gazing up at the towering metal, he felt an overwhelming peace. He had come seeking the truth, and in finding it, he had changed the world. But even as he stood there, the weight of the journey not yet done pressed against him. The Great Sleep was still a threat, still waiting for a verdict on humanity's capacity to change. Turning to walk away, Elliot knew that he couldn't rest, that this new purpose in his bones would drive him forward. Balance or oblivion. It was the choice the Andronians had laid before them, and he wouldn't stop until humanity answered with a resounding roar for life, for harmony, for the survival of every living thing on Earth. For the Andronian message wasn't just a judgment, it was an invitation to rebuild, to mend the fractures. And Elliot, now more than ever, felt that he was part of something vast, something sacred. He'd become a guardian, a custodian of life, and with that title came an unbreakable conviction that as long as there was strength in his body, he would fight. So, he took that step forward, a step into the unknown, knowing that he wasn't alone. All over the world, others were taking their own steps, fueled by the same dream, the same vision of a balanced world. Together they'd face the hardships, the long nights, the endless resistance. Because in the end, they were the guardians of the future, champions of life. And though the journey ahead was a hard, bitter road, Elliot knew that they would rise to the challenge,